The time is 8:10. Yet another problem's emerged to threaten the chances of a Brexit deal, and this time it seems a pretty unlikely one on the face of it. It's to do with legal advice. Mrs May is coming under a lot of pressure from her own MPs and some cabinet ministers to publish the advice she's been getting from her legal advisers on her Brexit plan. And why is this such a big deal? Well, I shall be asking that very question of the former Brexit Minister David Davis, who is with me. But first, the man with the job of demystifying the impossible job, I nearly said, of demystifying these seemingly arcane matters. Chris Morris. Right, it's to do with the backstop. Let's begin with that.
It is, and it's to do with how you get out of the backstop. I mean, broadly speaking, the version of the backstop that's currently being discussed says the following. If no permanent trade agreement which would avoid a hard border in Ireland is in place at the end of a post-Brexit transition period at the end of 2020, then what will come into place then would be a UK-wide temporary customs union. What does temporary mean? How temporary is temporary? What's to stop it becoming permanent? How does the UK extricate itself from that?
We're assuming that the idea of a time-limited deal is done.
The time-limited deal is off the table, right. And the EU has said it's not willing to accept a unilateral mechanism for the UK to say, right,
so
we're leaving.
We couldn't just say we've had it, right?
No. What's being discussed is a review mechanism where both sides decide jointly the terms on which this process could come to an end. There could be independent arbitration. Obviously, it's very technical, it's very legal, and therefore there are those who are saying we want to see the full legal advice on how this would work.
And why, obviously I can ask this of David Davidson, but in technical terms, why is it so tricky, this? I mean, why can't she just say, well, here we are, look, it's simple, he said this, I said that, we said, you know.
I guess it's where the legal and the political combine, isn't it? Or collide, I suppose is a better word. I mean, there are two different things here. There are those in the cabinet who are saying, you're showing us a summary, we'd like to see the entire legal advice. And the ministerial code certainly suggests that that should be the case, that stuff that is put into cabinet should be, the complete text of that advice should be available to cabinet ministers. Then there's a separate debate. MPs, Keir Starmer wants all MPs in the House of Commons to have access to the full legal advice. There are those who want the advice simply to be made public. And on that point, again, the ministerial code says, no, the government's correct in that. In ordinary circumstances, you wouldn't make such advice public. Now, you can argue that these are not ordinary circumstances, and I'm sure that's a debate that's going to play out over the next couple of years.
All right. Well, let's stay with us, Chris, because, feel free to chip in, because Dave Davis, you wouldn't argue with anything that Chris has said there, but presumably...
No, remarkably clear.
He always is. Excellent.
Yeah. But, better than most politicians.
Well, you said that. But why does it matter to you so much what the legal advice is?
Well, firstly, the issue behind it's enormously important. As Chris said, it determines when we leave the customs union, i.e. when we leave the union. And what's being proposed is handing this decision over to somebody other than the British people who took it a couple of years ago. In terms of...
Well, they took a decision that we should leave the union.
We should leave.
They didn't take any decisions
and
about...
Most of the communications I get, why haven't we left yet? I mean, but put that to one side. It's an incredibly important decision, both in terms of timing, but in terms of method. Who decides? How do we decide? On what criteria?
But those are political.
No, they're not. These are substantive criteria which will decide the future of the country, the biggest decision in my lifetime. Now, the issue here, as Chris said, is that there is an accepted tradition, a convention, that legal advice to the government is not released to the public. Generally, sometimes there are good reasons for that. If we're going to a court case, if you're going into a court case, you don't want your lawyer telling the other side what your tactics are going to be. Fine. But this is not a court case. This is the biggest decision that the Cabinet will take in its time, the biggest decision that Parliament will take. And remember, government has agreed, when I was Secretary of State, that Parliament will have the final say, the so-called meaningful vote.
And you are able to ask the Attorney-General questions in the House of Commons if you want to.
Yes, but this is a complex issue. You can't just get to it by one question here and one question
there. Well, ask
there.
Several questions in the House of Commons.
You'd have to ask a very large number of questions.
Well, why not?
And he can reasonably stand behind the argument, well, I've given that advice to the government, I can't put it in the public domain. So what we must see is the complete legal advice, not a summary, not something which just glides and glosses over all of the difficult issues, but the actual legal advice. After all, when the Attorney General is there to serve the country at the end of the day, not just serve the government, but he should provide the advice to the people who will make the decision. Normally, that's the cabinet. As Chris said, the ministerial rules say the cabinet should have all the information possible. There's no argument whatsoever on convention or common sense or tactics to withhold it from the cabinet, and in my view, either to withhold it from Parliament as well.
And what are you afraid of? What do you suspect are the reasons why she is declining to do what you want her to do?
Well, the only thing I can think of, other than sheer convention, I mean,
quite so, but that's the stated reason.
That's the state reason. The only thing I can think of is
what do you suspect?
Is that they feel that there are weaknesses in the public argument about what they're presenting. Now, there's been a big row. This row started when I was still Secretary of State about how we leave and when. I always said we must have a fixed final time. Right? If you don't have a fixed final time, there's no incentive on the other side to negotiate in good faith. And the evidence the last 2 years indicates they'll push every advantage. So there's no incentive to do it if you don't have a fixed final time. Then the government's now arguing for something which is an arbitration mechanism. We've got to know what the criteria are. We've got to know on what basis. Are we going to have to wait until the Irish government says it's OK to leave? If so, that's not acceptable. Are we going to have to wait until it's convenient to the Commission to say when we leave? If so, it's not acceptable. And I suspect that they've not pinned down any of these issues, and they need to be pinned down before Parliament votes.
The fact is that there is nobody of significance in the European Union who has ever suggested that a free trade agreement of the sort that you would like to see would not require the UK to accept a backstop. Nobody. There's not a single player in the game who would.
Well, this is a negotiation. It's not just a friendly public debate at Hyde Park Corner or whatever. This is a negotiation. They will take a stance, and we have to test the stance. One of the difficulties about the government's approach to the negotiation today has been they've been unwilling to take any risk in testing the European Union's stance on anything, with a possible exception of money. We did press them hard on money. Now, that means they'll never concede a point until you test it. You know, if you buy a house, you don't just take the first price offered, and you don't say, well, he never said he'd take a lower price. You press for a lower price. If you buy a car, the same. You buy anything. And this is a deal just like that. Much more complicated, but we have to press the button.
You were the chief negotiator at the time when we agreed to the backstop. Why are you surprised by all
well,
this? Well,
you also interviewed me on the day I resigned. And
that is very true. I remember.
And in the letter, I made it clear that I'd said to the Prime Minister at the time I was very uncomfortable with this proposal for exactly the reasons we're seeing here, that it will put us into a corner and then we'd be held in that corner until we've given up everything the European Union wants. That's not the way to carry out negotiation. It was bad strategy, bad tactics.
If you don't go get what you want here, if you do not get this full legal advice published, what happens then? Because, Chris, what we were talking about earlier was a review mechanism. Just explain what that is.
Well, and it's also worth pointing out, don't forget that if government lawyers in London are pondering every crossed T and dotted I, so
exactly
are lawyers in the European Commission and in 27 other capitals. It's not just about us.
Exactly.
But the review mechanism basically is a way that both sides are comfortable that there's an exit clause. But as Mr Davis has set out, there is a lot of ambiguity in there because you can either leave something or you can't. And if it's going to be a joint decision with possibly an independent arbitration system, it's a grey area. It's not a guarantee that you can leave on your own terms. You have to then negotiate with the other party the way that you would leave this temporary customs union. I'll give you the example of, we were talking about just outside Turkey. Now, Turkey's trying to get into the European Union. We're trying to get out. Turkey entered a customs union in 1995 with the EU, which at the time was described as temporary. 23 years later, it's still there. So I'm not saying that the UK would be in one for that long, but it's an example of the way in which temporary things which are difficult to resolve can stretch on for a long time.
I rest my case. And the two issues that are big criteria, one will be, they're both issues in which the Republic of Ireland in one case and the European Commission in both cases do not accept the government stance. One is how we obtain an invisible border, no hard border in Northern Ireland. We have put up practical proposals galore on this. Not just the government, people like David Trimble have as well. And they've not taken any notice at all. And the other one is on the future customs arrangement, the arrangements to actually how we run the customs afterwards. And they don't accept that either. So if it's sitting on their judgment in any way, it'll never happen. I mean, Turkey will be.
If the deal falls in Parliament then, what then happens? Do you expect Mrs May to resign?
No, I think what would happen if the deal fell in Parliament, which I think at the moment is looking like a probability, certainly if they don't release it.
You would expect to be voting against it?
I would, yes, because I voted against the whole I resigned over Chequers. But so no surprise there. But if it was voted down, then it'd have to go back to the Union once more. Now, this will be a slightly different atmosphere to currently, because both sides will be staring at no deal. Now, I've said publicly, I don't think no deal is as frightening as people think, but the government is obviously nervous of it, and the European Commission and all the member states, well, nearly all the member states, are nervous of it. So I think that would force a very, very different and actually, I think, rather better deal.
Why?
Because both sides would be under such pressure to get a good deal. Parliament would have said, no, that's not good enough. I mean, the sorts of reasons that Parliament will say no is because you've tried to bind us into a common rule book, which takes away our right to make our own decisions. You're trying to bind us into a customs arrangement, which makes us a tax collector for the European Union. You're not really giving us freedom of
But we get the benefit of remaining in the customs union, which an awful lot of people say is crucial to our economic progress.
Well, on the contrary, remaining in customs union stops us doing the deals, our own trade deals with the rest of the world. Already, the rest of the world is virtually 60% of our trade. It's a fast-growing sector. It's where our biggest customers are, and we need to be able to do those deals. The keeping us in the customs union is being done by the European Union because they don't want us to have that advantage.
Chris, the elephant in the room here, John, is that the backstop, if it is needed, is supposed to be in place unless and until a permanent deal removes any need for a hard border in Ireland. From the EU perspective, the only way you don't have that hard border in Ireland through entirely frictionless trade is to stay in the single market and the customs union. A free trade agreement, any type of Canada, you can add as many pluses to it, you can call it super, wouldn't actually achieve completely frictionless trade. Maybe as frictionless as possible, but on the Irish border in particular, that's a crucial distinction.
Well, be clear, because if it's tariff-free, virtually everything, in fact everything, can be done either using existing mechanisms.
Virtually.
No, I changed it to everything. Everything can be done using either existing mechanisms or tests elsewhere. And the European Commission recently has accepted that there'll be quotes tests in the market.
All right.
The local trading standards officer.
If it collapses, if this whole thing collapses, what do? Accept no deal? Do we crash out of the European Union? Or do we have another referendum?
I wouldn't use pejorative terms like crash out.
Fallout, whatever.
We would leave.
We'd leave, all right.
We'd leave, and there would be some hiccups in the first year, no doubt, but we'd have all the rights and controls over our own destiny.
But we don't have any plans for that eventuality.
Oh, yes, we do. Oh, yes, we do. We have about 300 of them.
Well, hang on. What?
Even when I left, they were very well advanced.
What? So that you mean we could leave next Thursday week and seamlessly all of these FTA deal, all of these agreements with all these other countries, these new trade relationships would happen, what, immediately?
They'd happen quite quickly.
That is simply not
No, I didn't. You're putting all sorts of words in my mouth. I didn't say any of that. I said, firstly, we can manage the exit because the sorts of fears that are put up.
Manage the exit?
Well, wait a minute. Yeah, manage the exit. Being a government's there to manage things sometimes, John. And
you could have fooled me over
the sorts of fears being put up. There'll be no insulin available, which is nonsense. It was proven to be nonsense. That there'll be food shortages, also nonsense, proven to be nonsense. That there will be problems. Let me finish. Let me finish. That there'll be problems on crossing from Dover to Calais. The people in Calais, the port authorities, the leader of northern France have all said that's not going to happen. So there's been a lot of scare stories. We're a big country. We can look after ourselves, and we will look after ourselves very well indeed once we're properly out of the European Union.
And you're telling me that in government, all of these eventualities have been discussed at length and allowed for. So there is a whole system of new rules, new proposals, new plans that will simply fall into place
there,
the
as I
day
said.
after, and I'm not going to say crash out, the day after we leave the European without any agreement
As I said,
whatsoever. It will be seamless.
No, I didn't say that.
I'm asking you whether it will be, because you can't have it both ways.
John, you keep trying to give me words.
Well, no, because you said there are hundreds of different bits and pieces all sorted out.
There are hundreds of plans.
And therefore,
hundreds of plans. Now,
hundreds of plans, and I'm assuming, therefore, that means it'll be seamless.
Of course, it depends on the terms under which we depart. And if let me finish. If there's a hostile relationship, there will undoubtedly be some frictions and bumps along the way. It won't
be a friendly one if we've said the hell with you, we're leaving.
But against that, and that's why I've said all along, and everybody in government said all along, that actually the best deal is a free trade deal. But don't be terrified of a World Trade Organization deal. After all, most of the rest of the world trade successfully with the European Union, indeed, in some arguments, more successfully than we do under World Trade Organization rules. And that's what we will achieve.
And that is what you want to happen?
No. What I want to happen is a free trade deal, Canada plus.
Which still wouldn't solve the Northern Ireland problem, the border.
The Northern Ireland problem is capable of solution by the existing arrangements, the existing tax collection arrangements, the existing customs arrangements, and by a few additional things which we've done in the ports, not at the border.
And if we do have some sort of agreement, should it be put to the people of this country in another referendum?
The people have already decided. 17.5 million, the biggest democratic decision in the history of the country, and the people who are pushing for another referendum, the people who don't like that decision. That's the main problem.
Thank you both
My
very
pleasure.
much indeed, David Davis and Chris. And
We'll come on again together.
Double act.
you're welcome.
But